Oh, did I have the camera on the whole time?
I just said, yes, man, right away, anything.
Today we're going to make some black cherry apple cider. It's a hybrid. This is actually going to be a really easy recipe. Most ciders are. So I'm going to take this opportunity to answer a couple of questions that I've had because that cider video I made kind of blew up. One of the questions I got was, what's the alcohol content of the cider when it's finished? This one's going to be about 6%. Let's see, what was one of the other questions? Oh, a really good one. I didn't realize so many people from around the world were going to be watching the video where you can't get this product. This is apple juice concentrate, and it comes frozen here in the States. But there's even places around in the United States that can't get this. And I use this in the last recipe. When the cider's finished fermenting, I mix it with this to boost the sugar content and also the flavor right before bottling. The sugar that the yeast is using to bottle carbonate the cider is actually from this apple juice concentrate. But since lots of you can't find it, I have a really easy solution. Let's get started. This is a really easy recipe, so I'm cooking dinner while I make it. Let's get going. Told you it was easy. So now we're just going to take this cider and put it into a dark place that's basically stable room temperature for 1 month. Now here's another question I get all the time. My cider stopped bubbling after 3 or 4 days. Is it done? No, it is definitely not done. Even though it looks like it's finished, there may not be any more bubbles or anything happening after a few days. You still want to give it a full month because there's a lot of invisible chemistry that's happening inside that jug. The flavor's maturing, the fermentation is finishing up, and also you're letting your cider clear. So you need to give it that time, give it that full month in a dark place to let it finish out. I got a perfect opportunity to answer one other question that I've gotten several times. What happens if my brew froths up and clogs up the airlock? The cherry juice had a lot of pulp in it, and the pulp will mix with the yeast and cause a really foamy head at the top of the brew, and that can push its way up into the airlock and clog it and fill it full of junk and all that kind of stuff. So what do you do in that circumstance? Here's what I'm talking about. There it is, it's just pushing its way into the airlock. This is the sediment from the cherry juice. This is the yeast. So the sediment is actually sitting on top, so it's getting forced up like that. Look at all that activity. So what do you do in this circumstance? Well, simple. You just sanitize your hands, sanitize the outside of the airlock, take it off, wash it out, and stick it back on. The main thing is to just be clean while you're doing it. Ideally, you don't want to open up your fermentation. Not at all. It increases the likelihood of some sort of contamination, either through bacteria or a bug flying in there or whatever. But there's really no alternative. If you know something like this is likely to happen in a brew, you can do a blow-off tube. It gives you the opportunity to not have to worry about cleaning that out and opening up your brew. These are actually designed, there's that tube in the middle where you can actually just poke a hose on top of that tube and stick that into a glass of water, and that acts as your airlock. This is what I'm talking about, where it goes in and it comes down to a cup. So if this one were to blow off, it would just go into this cup and I wouldn't have to reopen it to clean it. I would just change out the cup of water. Now you know, just take it off and clean it, or put a blow-off tube on. Or, if you really want to be smart, leave a larger air gap.
One eternity later.
It's bottling day. All right, so you remember that juice that we saved, that we had left over because we poured some out of the big jug and then we had a little bit of cherry juice left over? This ends up being about 48 ounces. And so what we're gonna do now is we're just gonna pour this into a pot and boil it down to about 12 ounces. And that's gonna take the place of our apple juice concentrate. We're basically just gonna make our own. While this is heating up, let's go ahead and answer a couple of more viewer questions that I get all the time. Can I just refrigerate my cider? Do I have to pasteurize it? No, you don't have to pasteurize it. You can just drop it in the fridge and that will knock the yeast down into dormancy, so they're basically not fermenting very much. It's a very, very low level fermentation that happens in the fridge. So instead of having a couple of days, you have a month or maybe a little bit more before you really need to drink that cider or pasteurize it. Any longer than that and you risk turning those bottles into bottle bombs because they'll eventually get overcarbonated. So keep that in mind. But if you have to store your cider in a room temperature or hot environment, if it's not going to be under refrigeration, you definitely need to pasteurize. Another question I get is, can I use other juices? Of course, you can ferment anything with nipples. I mean, you can milk anything with nipples.
I have nipples, Greg. Could you milk me?
Not nipples. You can ferment just about anything with sugar. So any kind of fruit juice you want to do, you can probably do with this recipe. Just make sure it doesn't have preservatives in it. Another question I get is, why is my cider so cloudy? Two reasons. Number one, did you remember to use the pectic enzyme that I recommended? No? Well, it's probably pectin haze. It's better to go ahead and get the pectic enzyme to make sure that your cider will drop nice and clear. And when I say clear, I mean clear. Long way to go. The other reason your cider might be cloudy is because you're not siphoning it properly. Using an auto siphon takes a little bit of practice to make sure that you don't kick up the yeast at the bottom of the jug and, fluff it up into your cider. Because if you do that, then it's going to be a little bit cloudy. I'll show you what I mean when we get ready to bottle. Another question I get about every week is, can I use bread yeast? You can, but it's not going to taste very good. Bread yeast is designed to work very hot and very fast, and it also leaves a really yeasty flavor. That's okay in bread, but if you take a gulp of your cider and it's all yeasty and tastes like bread, that's not very good. But if you use wine yeast or champagne yeast or cider yeast, those are designed to ferment much cleaner and to work better with fruit sugars. I highly recommend that you consider using some proper yeast. They're not expensive. The packets of yeast I get are like $1 or $2. You can get them from a homebrew shop. You can get them on Amazon. I'll put the links for some really good ones that I like and that I use all the time down in the video description. Check them out and you'll see how cheap they are. One other thing, those packets of yeast, they do 5 gallons of cider or wine or whatever. That's 20 liters. You don't need to use a whole packet in one of these 1-gallon jugs. You only need to use a fifth of a packet, basically like a half a teaspoon. Not a lot, because as that yeast starts to eat sugar, it reproduces, it multiplies inside the cider. So eventually it'll colonize that cider at the rate that it can support. You don't have to go crazy with putting the yeast in. So save some money and just make those packets last for 5 gallons. Looks like we've cooked it down by about 75%. So I'm going to turn off the fire, let that cool down for a minute, and then measure the volume to see if we hit the target. It looks like we're slightly under 12 ounces. I'm going to call that good. So my juice concentrate is cool now. You want to make sure that you cool that down. You don't want to add it hot because the heat might kill the yeast that's suspended in your cider. And you need that suspended yeast, not a lot, but you need a little bit in there that's alive to carbonate those bottles. If you've never siphoned your cider, if you've always poured it, stop doing that. You really need to use a siphon, because if you pour it, one, you're just transferring all the gooky, gross sediment, the yeast crap from the bottom into your bottles. And really you can do so much better with the flavor and the appearance if you don't do that. The other thing is you don't want to oxygenate it. If it splashes and gets all bubbly and stuff, you're oxygenating it, and that can really lead to another off flavor, which is kind of skunky, similar to light exposure. So siphon. If you've never used one of these, basically it's just a tube with a one-way valve on it and a little plunger dealy. Plug your hose onto there, and then we're going to drop this end into our cider and this end into our bottling bucket, and that starts the flow of the liquid, and we're keeping it tilted a little bit so we can get the last little dregs down here. You always want whatever you're siphoning from to be higher up than where it's siphoning to. Gravity is the only factor for siphoning, so So now that the bottling is done, we're going to leave these out at room temperature for several days until this Coke bottle starts getting super firm, just like a brand new unopened soda. That may take anywhere from 3 to 7 to 8 or 9 days. It just kind of depends on how much yeast you have mixed into suspension, and actually the room temperature also matters quite a lot. If it's really hot, this can go faster. So keep that in mind. Be flexible. That's what the test bottle's for. Trust the test bottle. When this is firm, chances are your bottles are ready. Who's that sexy guy back there? One last little thing. All you need to do is get an ice chest and toss your bottles in there. And it doesn't have to be one of these plastic ones. You can use a styrofoam ice chest and do the exact same thing. It'll contain any spills or any breakage or anything, and it'll also keep the temperature nice and stable. If the room where the bottles are going to be stored is really hot or really cold or fluctuates in temperature, with an ice chest you don't have to worry about that.
Day 4.
This thing is about as hard as a bullet. It is ready to go. Several people have asked in comments whether or not you pasteurize your plastic bottle. No. I just stick it in the fridge. One of the biggest problems when you're pasteurizing is not knowing exactly what temperature the cider is in the bottles. So we shoot for 180 degrees in our pot of water, but how do you know that the cider inside got up to 165 degrees? Because that's where it has to get in order to kill the yeast to prevent the bottles from continuing to ferment that sugar. I'm going to fill this bottle with room temperature water, and I'm going to stick that down in my pot with my bottles that need to be pasteurized, then throw a thermometer in it, and when the thermometer inside this bottle reads 165, then I'll know we're good. And I'm going to restate the warning for this. When you are pasteurizing bottles, you're taking pressurized glass bottles and putting them into very hot water. The potential for catastrophic failure for the bottles to explode or the caps to pop off or whatever is very real, so you need to be careful. Once the water is up to 180 degrees, turn the heat off, then put the bottles in, and then put a lid on. You don't want to pick up glass, trust me. I've only had maybe 3 or 4 bottles pop, but I've never had like glass shoot across the house or anything. It just pops. There's a lot of cleanup, but the glass really stays in there because the water kind of catches it and slows it down. Be careful. Turn the heat off after you get the water up to 180. Put your bottles in, lid on, and then walk away from it for about 10 minutes. Oh, did I have the camera on the whole time? Cool. Alright, so there you go. It happens to everybody. That sucks. The good news is, looks like most of the explosion, yeah, it's just cider all down in here. So there you go. Happens to everybody. Be safe. Alright, so here's the cider. It's all finished. As you can see, it's got a fantastic color to it. It smells amazing. You can smell the tart cherry, you can smell the apple in there. Honestly, I think it came out fantastic. But if you want to see the tasting, you need to stay tuned. I'm going to do a tasting video with George and Jesse, and I'll post a link for that right up here. I'm probably going to release it in the next couple of days. So stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned anything, if you enjoyed getting to have some of your questions answered, do me a favor, hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. If you want to see the tasting video, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon right next to it so you can get notified when I post that. And if you have any questions about this, any more questions about making cider, go ahead and post them down in the comment section down below. Now, the full recipe and all the links for everything that I used are down in the description, and that's always the case for every video I make where there's a recipe of something involved. It's always going to be in the video description. So if you need any clarification on how to do something, it's always right down below. Alright, thanks for watching. Talk at you later.